Hello, and welcome to the Super Feeler podcast. My name is Lori, and I'm super excited today to be joined by Antonia, who's going to be sharing a little bit about her experience with borderline. Antonia and I actually used to work together, and she's recently been diagnosed with BPD and reached out. We had breakfast. I don't know how long ago that was, maybe like 6 months, a year ago now, to talk a little bit about that process. So Antonia, I'm wondering if you want to introduce yourself and then we can kind of get into your story.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Lori. So, Atel Squalawal, Quells Quitzlala, Hayatia Telquelmuxqui, Talitzel Qua, Skelkel Casta, Huchchiam. Good day, everybody. I just introduced myself in my traditional language, which is Helkamalem. I come from the Coast Salish territory, the Stalo people, and my name's Antonia Francis. I am 35 years old, soon to be 36, and I am a mother of an 8-year-old girl named Eclipse and a 4-year-old boy named Rain. And it is my 1-year anniversary today, married anniversary. So super excited about that.
Congratulations. That's awesome. Sorry to take up your anniversary with podcasting.
Oh, no, it's okay. Unfortunately, he has to work on holidays. So.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. And I know you guys went on like a big little anniversary weekend, so that's good.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for introducing yourself in your traditional way. I think that's so important. And I know we have so many international listeners, so that might not be super common for them, but it's really beautiful to see, especially the Halkomelem language kind of coming back. So if any of the listeners are interested in Indigenous languages in Canada and like the history of that and how important it is for those to be used, you can always reach out and ask me questions or Google it. It's really important. So Antonia, I'm curious, do you want to tell us a little bit about like yourself generally, like your mental health story?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Lori. So as mentioned, I'm 35 years old, and I actually, it's such an intense story, and it kind of seems like it will go all over the place, but I lost my dad at the age of 14, and actually his funeral was on the day of my 14th birthday. And from there, my addiction started, my addiction to drugs and alcohol. And that lasted for probably 10 to 15 years. But as I got older and started to begin my recovery journey from drugs and alcohol, that's when I really started to explore my mental health and really start to look back at my history and start to try to identify and understand the gaps in my own life and the traumas within my own life that got me to where I ultimately landed, which was rock bottom, right? And so when I was talking to one of my sisters about my life and my journey of recovery and self-discovery and whatnot, she told me that she remembers when we went to Disneyland when I was 9 years old, and I was practicing bulimic then. And so I think my eating disorder started around the age of 8 and 9 years old. And that actually carried on. I'm still in the process of recovering from this eating disorder. And so, of course, there's always been these these little signs throughout my life, right? Like eating disorder, addiction. And then, once I got into my early 20s, I got into more serious domestic relationships. And those were always really hard for me. So it was like I I was quite often referred to as like the crazy woman or the psychopath, or like I've always had very intense emotions. Like I'm very reactive, I'm very insecure. My biggest fear is being alone and abandoned. And my actions always manifested out of these behaviors, you know what I mean? Or out of these thought processes, out of these struggles that I had going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, the emotions were always really big and really hard to manage. And it always felt almost as though I was high. I remember feeling like this level of anger or this level of anxiety almost could feel like a high, And so um I had gotten into a really bad place in my relationship. And this was after recovery, after getting sober and getting clean at the age of 30. And I I had gotten into a relationship, my current relationship, and we had gotten into kind of a domestic dispute. And no domestic dispute with me has ever been a normal, peaceful, let's sit down and communicate about our problems and our emotions and validate each other, and and then we'll carry on, right? Like my interactions with my partner have always been very big and scary, and
Yeah, like 0 to 100.
0 to 100, zero to
Yeah.
100. And like, I, every little tone that he gives to me or look, I internalize it and I turn it to like, I don't know. It's like I always feel like he's against me, and like I have to fight to the bitter end to make sure that he's not against me, or to make sure that I'm right, or to make sure that he stays, right? Like there's all these confusing, and our fights would get really confusing. But anyway, this one time it got so bad and we separated, and my mind was just not in a good place. Like I was in that very high emotional state. A really bad situation had just happened, and I felt extremely suicidal. Not because my husband was not there, but because I'm so tired of how much information I've gathered about myself, only to continue reacting the same way, only to
Mm.
continue to not really change, right? Like I've spent like 3 or 4 years doing all this crazy self discovery and reading these books and understanding myself and watching these videos and listening to these podcasts and like being like, oh, I think I fit there. I think I fit here. Like that makes sense. Taking some of all of these different approaches to healing, and nothing was changing. And I was so fed.
Yeah,
And
you like know that there's an ability to change, but you're not there yet. So you're like super frustrated because you're just like, well, why am I still like this if I have this self-awareness? Is that fair to say?
yes,
Hmm.
exactly. Exactly. And it's frustrating even for the people around me, right?
Yeah.
Because I come to these amazing realizations about myself. I share them with mostly my partner, right? Like, oh, this is why I did this, and this is, you know what I mean? Like I can be really like transparent and open and honest about where I fall short, right? Like I don't have a problem calling myself out and facing what I've done wrong. So I come to all these realizations and I get him excited, right? Because he's like, oh, she sees what she's doing. And then it happens again. Right. And so it's really like I feel like having me in people's life has always been very confusing, very stressful, and and scary, and so I was carrying all of that in this moment when I was driving, like kind of aimlessly, and I was done. I was done. I didn't want to be here anymore. I felt like a lost cause, and I was really scaring myself. And so I had actually checked myself into the psych ward, and not with the intention that like I felt as though in that moment I was actually going to take my own life, but because I knew that that was a safe place to go and that I would be able to get help quicker than if I was to go through some crazy process of waiting on a wait list for a psychiatrist
Yeah.
and blah, 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 right? Like I just knew that I needed help right now. And so I went there, I spent the night there. I got fast tracked and to a psychiatrist, and I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, unspecified bipolar,
Mm.
and which I'm still trying to kind of understand that one, and then depression, anxiety, and ADHD.
Wow. And did
So,
you have any of those diagnoses before you got to hospital?
well, depression and anxiety, yes. So I
Okay.
had actually gotten diagnosed with depression about, well, it was mostly postpartum related.
Right. Okay. So this is a
So
lot of information to be getting after in one shot. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
What
Well,
did,
okay, sorry, let me back up. Let me
yeah,
back up.
go for it.
So I got diagnosed with depression, anxiety, unspecified bipolar, and BPD. And then once we were able to kind of get those to a stabilized place, then they did an ADHD assessment. And then I got diagnosed
Mm,
with ADHD.
gotcha. And BPD
Yeah,
and ADHD have so much in common too. So that makes sense. Did you know what BPD was?
I didn't actually. And it's funny because, okay, so, well, before I got diagnosed, I did. And I kind of self diagnosed because my
Mm,
sister, about 2 or 3 years ago, well, yeah, around there, I'd say, sent me a video. It may have been a TikTok or something. She sent me a video and it was of a girl sharing things that come with BPD in her experience. And my sister was like, "Why is this you?" And I
uh,
watched the video and I was like, "What the heck?" Like for the first time, it felt like somebody truly understood me and even brought out things that I didn't know I was doing that
right.
like
You're
came to
seeing your
start.
own patterns now, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so that's when I started to like kind of watch the videos and read some of the books and really try to wrap my head around what BPD was. And I just kind of self-diagnosed. I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's me for sure, right?" But then I got clinically diagnosed eventually.
You don't need to say what hospital you were at, but is it the one near where you live?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So
Was there any like positive or negative experiences throughout that diagnosis process? Like sometimes people that are diagnosed with BPD face like like a lot of stigma from providers. Were they decent?
yeah, I would say that they were all really good to me. I felt like because I was in complete defeat and I was extremely transparent and open and ready and willing,
Hmm.
and I wasn't extremely in distress, right? I was just like, I know I need help. I'm a danger to myself right now, right? And
Yeah.
and so because I can speak and I know how to navigate the health system fairly well, I had the benefit of understanding how to navigate, I guess, which makes things easier for people who are taking part in the healthcare system, especially if you have addiction issues or if you have mental health struggles. But I think I had the benefit of understanding a system that can be fairly scary to a lot of people and
Mhm.
intimidating, and therefore I was able to advocate for myself really well. And I think that
Yeah.
didn't that didn't create any space for any of the healthcare professionals to make me feel any kind of way or to seem kind of authoritative or I don't know how to explain it. Like,
That's awesome. I'm super glad to hear
yeah.
that because that like
Okay.
I mean obviously like you and I worked in health together. So like
Yeah.
we totally know the system. We know that hospital well. And honestly, they probably know us too, right? Like
Yeah.
we've
Yeah.
they've seen our faces just like as professionals walking around too. Okay, can we backtrack for a sec? So this was kind of like mental health rock bottom. You were still sober at this point, right?
Yes.
And so had you had like a rock bottom that kind of changed your sobriety, like okay, that's not the right way of wording it. Had you had a moment of rock bottom that made you decide to become sober
Yes,
previously?
definitely. Yes, definitely. I was 30 years old. It was literally 30 days after my 30th birthday.
Mm.
And at that point, within that month of turning 30, I had come home after a bender to a group of women from my family that were having a intervention on me.
Oh,
And
wow.
because at that point my mom was taking my daughter all the time for me, so I would kind of put her to bed, and then because I lived with my mom I would just leave, right? Like it was easy for me to just kind of take off. And so I did that quite often, and it was getting worse and worse to the point where I wasn't coming home for days on end and my mom was having to care for my daughter. And so she decided to have this intervention for me, and I got quite upset and I walked out because I
Fair.
wasn't ready to hear it, right? I've always been a very, I guess you could say, stubborn person. And I tend to go, you tell me one thing, I'll do the other. I can be very defiant. So don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me how to live my life. That's the attitude I always carried. And so I walked out My pride was hurt, of course. I went on another bender, and my mom was leaving for a couple of weeks. And I remember her being terrified that she was leaving because she didn't want to leave my daughter with me. And my daughter was
Mm.
actually camping with her other grandma at the time. And I was on this bender. And then all of a sudden, I get a call from the other grandma saying, "Okay, we're back. You have to come get Eclipse." And I remember thinking, how am I going to do this? Like,
Right.
I haven't slept in 4 days. I'm a complete mess. My mom is nowhere. She's like out of the country, and I have to go get my daughter, right? And so I did. And
Well, she would have been like what, 3?
two, she was
2.
two. Yeah. And so I went to get her, and we went to my friend's house, and he had a pool, and so we were hanging out outside, and she was kind of running around in the yard and around the pool and having fun. And I was laying there, and I remember looking at her and just how happy and bright and energetic she was, and just beautiful. And she wanted me so badly. Like, she'd be like, "Mommy, come, mommy, play, mom, look." And I was just dying, literally dying.
Hmm.
I couldn't move. I couldn't get myself up to like feed her barely. And I just remember thinking, I'm never going to do this again. I never want to be the mom that can't even get up to feed her child, you know? And I never drank again.
Wow.
And so that week I kind of reached out to some friends that I knew were in recovery. And I've kind of paved the way ever since through various ways of healing. And yeah, that was my rock bottom, July 30th, 2018.
So, how did that rock bottom differ from your mental health rock bottom? I don't know if that's even like a valid question, but I'm curious.
No, definitely. The mental health rock bottom is a little bit harder to swallow because for myself, there was so much shame in understanding the fact that the problem wasn't alcohol and drugs, you know?
Oh,
Like,
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like intrinsic instead of like you can't blame something else
yeah,
anymore.
it's me. It's
Interesting.
literally me. Like,
Yeah.
and so it's kind of like I learned you take the drugs and alcohol away, which was my solution, my coping mechanism, right? And I'm left with myself. And
Yeah.
all of these things inside of me that I've suppressed throughout these years are like flaring up now, right? And like I've never fully felt emotions. I've never fully felt grief. I've never fully like experience these different things, right? And like relationships sober, and you know what I mean? So like it felt as though my reactions had like intensified times a million.
Right, of
And
course.
so
Yeah. You're
yeah,
not dampening them anymore.
yeah, exactly. And then so this mental health rock bottom came with definitely a lot more shame and a lot more fear and worry that I was just never going to be able to change, and that I'm stuck this way forever. I'm always going to hurt the people around me. I'm always going to be confusing and, like wake up today and say, I'm going to buy a truck. And you know what I mean? Or like,
Yeah. You do have a nice truck, but
thank you.
yeah, that impulsivity hits hard.
Oh, yeah.
Um, so yeah, like, and so I haven't struggled with substance use, which is I'm very thankful for, but I could imagine that it's also probably a little bit more complicated when you're having that mental health rock bottom because there isn't a clear, well, this is the issue and I can just stop doing this now. I realize that getting sober is not as easy as just stop, like I'm just gonna not do this anymore. But like there's like a clear black and white of like if I don't use, then in theory my problem is gone.
Yes, exactly.
With mental
Exactly.
health, you can't just not have emotion because that's not reality. And so
Exactly.
that
And
would
it's
be so
kind of
much
like,
more complicated.
yeah, it's kind of like the food theory, right? Like the food addiction theory. Like it's hard
Yeah,
because we can't just quit food, right?
totally.
Like so it's about finding the tools that can support you in your everyday life to be able to respond differently and to see differently, right? Like
Hmm. Well, I have so many questions. Okay, I'm going to start with an earlier question and like the thing. So, um,
mhm.
did you tell people around you about your diagnosis when you first got it, or did you keep that kind of like close to the chest?
I started to share it with my closest people, especially because medication was stepping into my life. And, I have a wonderful support system, and I have family who have experienced similar things with their mental health. And so I had a really strong support system coming in to help me as I went on to meds and changed my meds and came off and went back on. Like, it's been a journey, right? Trying to figure out what works.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And so, yeah, I started to tell the people closest to me. And then I began to slowly start to tell my story at a broader level.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Did you experience any negative reaction when you told people about your diagnosis?
Not so much. You know what was really surprising coming from an Indigenous community, a very large Indigenous community, was that so many people started to think like, I wonder if I have that.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
100%.
because, and even me understanding my diagnosis to the level that I do today, seeing the people around me, my family members and the people I've grown up with who I know may have similar traumas or experiences, I can see a lot of the same tendencies and
Mhm.
struggles, but I'm not going to go and say, "Hey, you know what?"
Yeah.
you know, but I've noticed that that it these tendencies definitely exist at a broader level in the Indigenous community. A lot of people that I've shared my experience with have definitely you could see that their wheels are spinning, and they're kind of wondering if maybe someone in their family struggles, or if they do, or you know what I mean. So it's just
Mhm.
definitely become more of an awareness piece.
Yeah, which is amazing. And I'm so glad that you can do that because like I just like for context for the listeners, I worked like in mental health and substance use, like kind of advising whatever, with a lot of the communities near where Antonia lives. And I remember being like, why is nobody talking about borderline here? because
Hmm.
because I was seeing people like me every single day. And like and I was just like, what on earth? Not a single person. I worked in that like field for 4 years. Not a single person mentioned borderline to me one time. Yet like suicide, self-harm, substance use, impulsivity, like all of these things were coming up on a daily basis, but there was never like an, oh, well, maybe it's emotion dysregulation. That just like never was talked about. And I didn't want to, obviously, I can't diagnose people and I don't want to, like, unless it's something that they want. But I remember being like, wow, it really sucks that like there seems to be a lack of understanding that this might be part of the problem because it can help with the solution. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the struggles that I have walking in community today, is that I see so many people carrying these burdens that they don't understand. The It's just such a really twisted system. Like, I feel like I'm so lucky because I worked in a healthcare system. I understand what services are out there, how to navigate, how to get myself help, and how to ask for help, where to ask for help, all of those things that you need to know, right? But there's so many people, one, that don't understand or know that there's something wrong with living in this headspace. Two, that there's a way out, right? And three, how to seek that.
Yeah.
Because I feel like if I had taken the long route, right, I would have lost interest by the time I actually got an appointment with a psychiatrist. I would have been like, oh no, I'm over it. Or today's a good day when the
Yeah.
psychiatrist called for my appointment, so I'm fine, right? And so I can see how so many people fall through the cracks and just live in this, what I consider hell.
Yeah. And if you don't know anything different, then you don't know that it doesn't have to be this way.
Exactly.
And so I really like, I'm so thankful that you're like using your voice because, you're well liked, you're well respected. Like people will start to be like, oh, wow, I wonder if this is something. that I should be thinking about for myself. And like the diagnosis part isn't the make or break, right? Like you don't have to be diagnosed if you don't want to. I always say that like diagnosis is like something that if it's beneficial for the person being diagnosed, then that's great. And if not, then they don't need to. But what you can learn is that, oh, maybe I have these intense emotions, and my reactions are stemming from those emotions. So now I can understand how I can try and like actually meet, how I can actually start to not feel the emotion, but be able to tailor my reaction to be a safer reaction or a more appropriate reaction.
Yes.
And like, I mean, when I was a kid, I was put in anger management counseling all the time. And I didn't have an anger management problem. I had a emotion regulation problem. And
Right.
so I was
Yes.
put in these anger management things, and it was like, well, this isn't speaking to the part of my brain that I actually need it to speak to. Once I was able to learn how to manage my emotions, my anger management issues started to go away.
Exactly. Yes, totally.
Yeah. So have you accessed, I know you said medication, so I'm curious like how that's been going. And then have you been accessing any like dialectical behavior therapy or any counseling services?
Yeah, definitely. So the medication that they prescribed me, it has been a bit of a journey. So I started with Prozac um for the anxiety, and then the Wellbutrin I
Uh,
was on, and then they had me on Respiridol,
okay.
but I wasn't a big fan of that one. I had told my doctor from the beginning that I'm not opposed to medication. I've never been opposed to it. I'm not one of those like I don't need anything. But I also don't want to be a walking zombie, right? Like
Yes.
I had been on medication before for anti or for depression, and it almost had felt as though I was completely numb to the world, and I didn't like that. So I asked for them to change me off of Respiridol because I was starting to feel that way again, like a kind of a walking zombie.
Well, and I would
And
assume that like that feeling is probably also like extra triggering because of the substance use history, right? Like
yes.
that
Yeah.
it could kind of like make you feel like you're going back into that place.
Yeah, exactly. And so then once they took me off of Respiridol, that was when I was just on the Prozac and Wellbutrin at that time, and things were okay. So they stabilized me with just those two. And then that's when I did the ADHD test. And now I'm
Mm.
on a medication for ADHD as well as Prozac and Wellbutrin. And this is the best I've felt. I definitely like everything is a little bit slower. I'm still fairly emotional and sensitive.
Yeah.
Um,
That's not a bad
but
thing though.
right? Yeah, like I'm learning to honor my sensitivity rather than shame myself for it because
Yes.
and those are conversations me and my husband have been having because it used to be a little bit frustrating for him how sensitive I was, but upon our many conversations around my mental health, he's come to learn that that's just a part of who I am, and that's okay. And he can deal with that and honor that and love me for it, right? And so and a part of that was exciting for me because then I could start to feel like I could accept that within myself, right? Because one of my
Mhm.
biggest fears in life, of course, is what people think of me. So,
Yeah, and like I mean my husband gets annoyed by my strong emotions too, I'm sure, but like it all like seeing that those are also the strong emotions that like make us love them so much extra and get so much more excited and passionate and like the positives of those strong emotions are at least equal to the negatives if not outweigh them and if you like or harness them correctly.
yeah, exactly. And I think I just had to kind of stray away from the various stories that I would tell myself if he looked at me wrong or if he
Mhm.
didn't hear me while he was sending a text, or you know what I mean? Like if I
Yeah,
didn't hear from
totally.
him all day, I'm telling myself all these stories and reacting off of it, right? And so I think that that's where we've been able to get most of the help in our communication styles is when I feel triggered, I can a, use my tools to walk through that, or B, go to him to help me navigate it, right? And so
Mhm.
definitely a lot different. Whereas before I'd be like, why aren't you listening to me or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah. And then you're like,
so,
wait a minute, maybe he didn't hear me.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the medication thing is it like that. I'm so super glad that you've got a combination that's working for you. And I mean, honestly, the medication thing, I mean, I've been on medication for since I was 10 or 11 and I'm 30, so whatever that is, almost 20 years. And it's still a constant up and down of, what do I take? What do I not take? Is there a better combination?
Mhm.
Whatever, right? Like it just is what it is. But what does like therapy looked like for you?
So I do once a week therapy, and that has been life changing. It actually took me a long time to find a counselor that I'm compatible with, which
Mhm.
can be a little bit discouraging at first when you're seeking help for healing, right? Like, one thing I always struggled with was like, one, I'm so self-aware that what could you possibly tell me that I don't already know about myself, right? Like I couldn't I would struggle to sit with counselors because it kind of felt like um I was ahead of the game or something, right? Like, oh,
Mhm.
I already know that, oh, whatever, right? But then I finally found this one woman, and thankfully, I had supports that always told me never to give up. Like, because I'd be like, no, counseling doesn't work, right?
Mhm.
But they're like, no, you just have to find the one. So I found this lady, and she's an elder, and she is wonderful. And she's helped me to work through the various, well, mainly my anger, right? Because that's one of the biggest emotions that I carry is my anger. And
Same.
so through various strategies and just really understanding myself and EMDR, I've been able to kind of slow things down in my mind a little bit. And I practice meditation daily now because of the progress that I've had with my counselor. And I meditation has saved me. I swear it saves me every day. I'm too scared to not do it anymore.
Right. Yeah. It's like part of your toolkit that you have to do, which
I
is
have
good.
to. Yeah.
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 I mean, if I found that to be a really hard part at the beginning, I mean, I still am not great at it, but it does make such a big difference when you do it.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, like my brain is constantly a big mess, right? But I have, guided meditation helps me with all the sounds and like the calming voice telling me to feel it in my toes or whatever. And I'm finding that the guided meditation is really helping me to just slow things down in my mind and my body because it always had felt as though there was like a million alarms going off everywhere. And like to the point where my body would almost uncontrollably twitch. And I noticed that when I'm not taking that time for myself to really ground myself and gather myself, and when I'm not doing that throughout the day, it's just so much easier for things to happen and me to react, right? Like so mindlessly.
Yeah, of
So
course.
I definitely need to practice that mindfulness.
Well, I'm so glad that you were able to find a counselor that was like that fit well with you because that is really hard.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that it's probably even harder because you're such a cultural person. And to find a counselor that understands that must be really difficult.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah. Because
And
that's like a whole other thing, right?
exactly. Yeah, the culture and that's another part of it, right? Like really trying to understand the cultural practices and how they I can utilize those practices to make me well and not just go through the motions because I think that in our world today it's so easy to start to go through the motions of the cultural practices because of the world we live in and not
Mhm.
actually take the time to slow down and use it to help you get well and to heal and so again just like the ripple effect of healing and understanding and gaining the knowledge and tools to support my mental health struggles, I can slowly start to use those things that already exist in my life to help me, right? And rather than them always being like a stressor or a burden or something I have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm so glad that we had this conversation. And when you first reached out, like, and we had breakfast that one day, I was so excited because, like, I just like you and we haven't seen each other in a long time, but also because I feel like this is such a moment for you, but also for all of those around you that like maybe are experiencing very similar things and just don't have a name for it. And the name can really help with the care and like the next steps because it does feel a lot of the time before you have that like understanding of just like, oh, I'm just a flawed human. And like
Yes.
I'm gonna be a flawed human forever, and I may as well just continue to be a flawed human because that's how I am. We're not flawed, we're just different, but also there's so much that we can do to learn how to live in less distress. And
Yes.
it's hard to learn those things if you don't know what's going on and what's causing the distress.
Exactly. And that's ultimately it, right? Like, um, I know there was a moment in time where I was like, I have to get better for my daughter and my husband. But then upon the journey of healing, I was able to discover that I just want to freaking live in peace every day, and
Right. Yeah.
that's what all of this stuff is about, right? Like I just want to feel comfortable in my head and in my body, and I've never been able to, right? Like I always used to say, don't leave me unsupervised in my head.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, I will spiral forever if that
Yeah,
happens.
yeah.
Well, Antonia,
So
is there anything that we haven't talked about that you really wanted to cover today?
no, I think like I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share my story, and I think like just really acknowledging that if there are struggles with addictive behaviors to and it's not just drugs and alcohol, right? Like it's sex, it's shopping, it's men, it's fitness, like anything, work,
Food,
right?
yeah.
Like all food, all of these things can be a contributing factor to our addictions. And um if we could just kind of slow down, understand what our body is trying to tell us and whatever that looks like, right? I think we can learn to follow. Like our bodies are always communicating to us. It's just about slowing our minds down to be able to listen, right? And there are tools out there to help us do that, because I think everybody deserves healing and freedom from their own messy brain.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. One of the questions that I like to finish episodes off with is what is your favorite part about borderline personality disorder?
My favorite part, I think I always say that the fact that I am here, there, everywhere, and so quick to move and jump from one place to the next and one task to the next is that I meet a bunch of great people. I have a ton of great people in my life. There may not be a lot of consistency in personality, but I
Right.
have a lot of great people in my life. And I think one of the other things that I always joke about is that I feel like I'm as successful as I am in my life because of it. Like I've been able to, when I want something, I'm not going to stop until I go get it. Right. And when I have a million things to do, it doesn't stop me or overwhelm me. Right. I just kind of, it may look messy the way I'm getting my task list done, but it gets done. you
Yeah.
know?
The
So I,
motivation is definitely there and
yeah,
we will
I've
get what
always
we
had.
aim for.
Exactly, exactly. And it's come with a lot of negative tactics like manipulation and stuff, but those are all again things that I've had to learn how to put aside so that I can to walk in a way where I carry integrity, right? And so I have found that I can live with this diagnosis and be a woman of integrity. And that's been kind of my favorite journey of this whole thing.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Antonia, for coming on and sharing your story. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Of course. Thank you, Lori.
Anytime. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Superfeeler podcast. Today's episode was recorded on the unceded traditional territory of the Matsqui and Sumas First Nations. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps me reach more listeners like you, and we're always looking for improving the podcast. Remember, you can always stay connected with me on social media. You can follow us. The show notes will have all of the details for Instagram profiles. If you want to support the podcast and help me continue to bring great content, please consider joining the Superfeeler community on Patreon. Your support really means the world to me, and there's a variety of different options for support, including some free ones. For all information about the Superfeelers Club, which is the peer support that we run, including upcoming events and resources, head over to Eventbrite or laurieedmondson.com for more information. And if you have a topic that you want me to cover or a guest you'd love to hear from, please send me the suggestions. Always happy to hear them. Until next time, keep on superfeeling and living authentically. This is Laurie signing off of the Superfeeler podcast.